Hello, everyone. This is Kevin Mann again. I apologize for the delay, but I did. I took a long time getting this video done because I'm not a very arrogant person. I I'm not very well. I'm very humble, I think. Um, I'm not one of these people who can just come out and say, "Oh, I'm right and everybody else is wrong," that kind of thing. I just can't bring myself to be so confident. I'm always going to have that self-doubt. I'm always going to have that. Um, that's the beauty to me, anyway, of, say, science. The reason I like science is because it allows me to collaborate. In other words, I can posit an idea, and whether how well it floats or how well it sinks, in other words, how well other people adapt or adopt that theory, I can gauge, well, just how logical or rational this theory is. Um, but with, pseudoscience, of course, is, oh, yeah, believe me, I know the truth. These people are espousing, saying, don't question them. And so I would never say that because I basically don't, like I said, don't have that kind of confidence. I'm kind of like Marcus Aurelius, to where I'm like, there is no truth. There's only perception or perspective. There's only, your perception of the world around you. So this whole idea that you can know truth, by yourself, just independently, is to me a misnomer. It's it seems irrational in a sense, because to rely only on yourself, I don't think anybody can and should rely totally on themselves regarding, say, evaluations of what is, what is truth. In other words, because there can always be something said or something done that maybe was out of your range or that was out of your focus. And so by having other people who can fill you in on the full picture of what happened, or what was said, or what that dispute was involving, I think there's a lot of moving parts. Usually it's not just a pure black and white. There's usually very many shades of gray in most conflicts or most disputes and this kind of thing. So I would just say that I'm not an arrogant person, and so that's why it's taken me some time to, even though I have some confidence, because I've put an awful lot of time into researching this stuff, and so I think finally I am at a point to where I can, maybe present some of these ideas to you, my fellow human beings, and say, if you want your republic back, because we've already lost it. We've lost our republic. Our republic technically is gone. Because I would have to say, because I collaborate with other people, I basically stand on the shoulders of giants. Robert David Steele, Karl Popper, James Corbett. James Corbett, he's from Canada. He's Canadian, but he's in Japan at the moment, I believe. But he is someone who helped me wake up, say, years ago. And I definitely, send a shout out to him. Thank you, James, for all that you've said and done over the years. Whitney Webb, reading her books basically has helped me to gain more confidence that, okay, I'm on the right trail. And that, there seems to be other people who are coming to these same assessments, these same ideas that I am. But the problem is, too many people aren't not willing to say, okay, well, this is how you fix it. Me, I am more about, I'm a fixer. I am determined to, like, okay, let's fix this. Let's make it right. I'm not satisfied. In other words, my father always said, he said, Kevin, don't complain unless you have a solution. So if you can't offer a solution, just shut up and sit down. So that's one reason I've always had that attitude, where I'm not going to complain until I actually can offer you a solution. And that's why I'm doing it today, is because I have a solution. Whether you like it or not, that is totally up to you. That's why I'm saying I'm not an arrogant person. I'm just saying, as far as I can tell, and what I've deduced over the years is there's only like one way to actually fix this that I can figure out, and that is actually going to be where we can actually get the republic back. And anyway, I give a shout out to Candace Owens again. But, I stand on the shoulder of giants. And one of the assumptions, I also have to start this video with 4 assumptions. The 4 assumptions that I start this video with is that, one, that America is no longer a democracy. It's an oligarchy. Because it's an oligarchy, it basically, as I'll let the Gillens-Page study, Gillens I think was from Princeton, Page was from Northwestern, but they show through their data that we are no longer a democracy. We are an oligarchy.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong. But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question. Does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left, at 0%, are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right, at 100%, are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it with the most expensive healthcare in the world. We pay for it with a tax code that's a complete mess. We pay for it with internet that's slower and more expensive, with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, a catastrophic drug war, and 1 in 5 American children born into poverty. Almost every major issue we face as a nation can be traced back to this graph. How does this happen? Well, just follow the money. Right now, it's perfectly legal to buy political influence in America. Here's how it works. Let's say a big bank wants a law that would force taxpayers to bail them out again if they repeat the exact same reckless behavior that crashed the global economy in 2008. Not exactly the most popular idea with the public, and Congress knows that. That should be the end of it. But that's where the money comes in. It's perfectly legal for our bank to hire a team of lobbyists, whose entire job is to make sure that the government gives the bank what it wants. Then, those lobbyists can track down members of Congress who regulate banks and help raise a ton of money for their re-election campaigns. It's perfectly legal for those lobbyists to offer those same politicians million-dollar jobs at their lobbying firm. Then, those lobbyists can literally write the language of this new bailout law themselves and hand it off to the politician they just buttered up with campaign money and lucrative job offers. And it's perfectly legal for those politicians to take the lobbyist-written language and sneak it through Congress at the last second. So now you've got a law that greatly benefits the banks, and the whole process can start over. This is how a bill becomes a law. A special interest hires some lobbyists, those lobbyists collect campaign contributions, offer jobs, and then write the laws that Congress then passes to help those same special interests. This happens every day on every single issue with politicians of both parties. In the last 5 years alone, the 200 most politically active companies in the United States spent $5.8 billion influencing your government. Those same companies got $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support. And that's trillion, with a T. And that's just the top 200 companies. Never mind every other special interest, every union, every trade association, and every billionaire. Every single one of them can use their money to buy political influence. You know, there's this idea out there that this only became a problem after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. But the data goes back almost 40 years, and the results are clear. Corruption is legal in America. And as long as it is, anyone who can spend money to buy political influence will. The solution here isn't rocket science. Make corruption illegal.
Well, as they said, we are, of course, corruption is legal in America, according to Represent Us. I like that video. I think it's pretty concise, pretty clear. But of course, then the European or Anglo-American corruption that we're seeing in the world today is global. It is global. John Perkins, who was a economic hitman, he can basically just clarify exactly how and why I would say this is a global problem.
Okay. The corporatocracy is this group of individuals, men mostly, few women, who run our biggest corporations. And they really act as the emperor of this empire. They control our media, either through direct ownership or advertising. They control most of our politicians because they finance their campaigns, either through their corporations or through personal contributions that come out of the corporations. And they're not elected. They don't serve a limited term. They don't report to anybody. They really very, very much are running things. And they work under the premise that they should maximize profits regardless of the environmental and social costs. At the very top of the corporatocracy, you really can't tell whether a person's working for a private corporation or the government because they're always moving back and forth. So, you know, you've got a guy who one moment is the president of a big construction company like Halliburton, and the next moment he's vice president of the United States, or the president who is in the oil business. And this is true whether you've got Democrats or Republicans in the office. You have the moving back and forth through the revolving door. So you really can't distinguish. And in a way, our government is invisible a lot of the time, and its policies are carried out by our corporations on one level or another. And then again, the policies of the government are basically forged by the corporatocracy and then presented to the government. They become government policy. So it's an incredibly cozy relationship and a very dangerous relationship. I think that's part of what, as we move forward and we move out of this empire and we look for solutions, how do we create a better world for our children and grandchildren? One of the most important things is to break that bond there and to make people responsible more to just creating a decent world, creating an environmentally sustainable, socially just and peaceful world. It's interesting because the big corporations depend so much on the banking system, the whole financial system, the whole Wall Street system, and the banks. On the other hand, the banks depend on the corporations to make their money. So with the money that they have, they're going to invest it someplace, so they're going to invest it primarily in corporations. And so there's this symbiotic relationship between them that exists. You couldn't have the huge corporate structures that we have without the banking structure that we have, and you couldn't have the banking structure that we have without the corporate structure that we have. And once again, it's that corporatocracy. And you've got the people moving back and forth between these things, working with each other. So the big corporations almost always have financial people on their boards, and the big financial institutions almost always have corporate people on their boards. And there's this interweaving and intermeshing at the very, very top. And then all of them, at one point or another, probably work for the government or with the government. And the government people come into the banking system or the corporate system when they retire from government. And then maybe they go back again at some point in time. So it's a very insidious and I'd have to say a corrupt system, a system that just feeds into the hands of what we call the corporatocracy, and to a large degree works against everybody else in the world. Well, we economic hitmen really have been the ones responsible for creating this first truly global empire. And we work many different ways. But perhaps the most common is that we will identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, industrial parks, ports, things that benefit a few rich people in that country, in addition to our corporations, but really don't help the majority of the people at all who are too poor to use much electricity, or the ports, or don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks. However, those people, the whole country is left holding a huge debt. It's such a big debt they can't repay it, and that's part of the plan, that they can't repay it. And so at some point, we economic hitmen go back to them and say, listen, you owe us a lot of money, can't pay your debt, so sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Allow us to build a military base in your country, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq, or vote with us on the next UN vote. And in that way, we've really created an empire, but we've done it very, very subtly. It's clandestine. So all the empires of the past were built on the military, and everybody knew they were building them. So the British knew they were building them, the French, the Germans, the Romans, the Greeks, and they were proud of it. And they always had some excuse, like spreading civilization, spreading some religion, something like that. But they knew they were doing it. We don't. The majority of the people in the United States have no idea that we're living off the benefits of a clandestine empire. That today there's as much slavery in the world, more slavery in the world than ever before. That our shirts, our shoes, everything we own is made under the guise of this empire, and that there's a tremendous amount of people around the planet suffering as a result of this. We are less than 5% of the world's population living in the United States. We're consuming more than 25% of this world's resources. That's a tragedy.
We got that one. So Arbenz. What happened with Arbenz?
When Arbenz became president of Guatemala, the country was very much under the thumbs of United Fruit Company, the big international corporations. And Arbenz ran on this ticket that says, we want to get the land back to the people. And once he took power, he was implementing policies that would do exactly that, give land rights back to the people. United Fruit didn't like that very much. And so they hired a public relations firm, launched a huge campaign in the United States to convince the United States people, the citizens of the United States, and the press of the United States, and the Congress of the United States, that Arbenz was a Soviet puppet, and that if we allowed him to stay in power, the Soviets would have a foothold in this hemisphere. And that at that point in time was a huge fear on everybody's mind. We all the Red Terror, the Communist terror. And so, to make a long story short, out of this public relations campaign came a commitment on the part of the CIA and the military to take this man out. And in fact, we did. We sent in planes, we sent in soldiers, we sent in jackals, we sent everything in to take him out, and did take him out. And as soon as he was removed from office, the new guy that took over after him basically reinstated everything to the big international corporations, including United Fruit.
So move on to Roldos. What happened?
Ecuador, for many, many years, had been ruled by pro-U.S. dictators, often relatively brutal. They often claimed to be democratic, but they weren't. They were dictators. And then it was decided that they were going to have a truly democratic election. Jaime Roldos ran for office. He was a young, dynamic lawyer, and his main goal, he said, as president, would be to help Ecuador use its resources, particularly its oil, to pull its poor people up by their own bootstraps, to make sure that Ecuador's resources were used to help the people. And he won, overwhelming, by more votes than anybody had ever won anything in Ecuador. And again, first democratically elected president after many years of essentially dictators. And he began to implement these policies to in fact do that, to make sure that the oil companies were taxed, or if not, to be nationalized, to make sure that the profits from oil went to help the people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. I was sent down as one of several economic hitmen, and in that particular job I wasn't the primary one. I was sent in from Panama to help some of the other ones to change Roldos, to corrupt him, to bring him around, to let him know, okay, you can get very rich, you and your family, if you play our game, but if you continue to try to keep these policies you've promised, you're going to go. He wouldn't listen. He knew that his life was in severe danger. I've become good friends with his daughter in recent years. She's now in her 40s and a member of the Congress in Quito, in Ecuador. And she said her dad was very aware that he was taking huge risks, but he took them anyway, and he was assassinated.
And the means of assassination was?
His airplane, officially his airplane crashed. He and his wife were on board, and several other men and women, and the defense minister and his wife. And the pilot of that plane, according to Marta Roldos, Jaime's daughter, was a very good family friend, wouldn't have done anything foolish. She says that the official reports, which claim that the weather was very bad and they hit a high mountain, are erroneous. The weather wasn't that bad where they were by the standards of Ecuador. It was raining. It rains a lot in the coastal plain, and they weren't even in the high mountains. They were coming up in the coastal area, according to Marta. Also, what we do know is that as soon as the plane crashed, the whole area was cordoned off, and nobody was allowed in. Even the local police, the Ecuadorian police, were not allowed in. The only people allowed in were the U.S. military from a nearby base, and some of the Ecuadorian military that worked closely with the Ecuadorian military. When an investigation was launched, two of the key witnesses died in car accidents before they had a chance to testify. A lot of very, very strange things that went on around the assassination of Jaime Roldos. I, like most people who've really looked at this case, had absolutely no doubt that it was an assassination. And of course, in my position as an economic hitman, I was always expecting something to happen to Jaime, whether it be a coup or assassination, I wasn't sure, but that he would be taken down because he was not being corrupted. He would not allow himself to be corrupted the way we wanted to corrupt him. Iraq actually is a perfect example of the way the whole system works. So we economic hitmen are the first line of defense. We go in and we try to corrupt the governments and get them to accept these huge loans, which we then use as leverage to basically own them. If we fail, as I failed in Panama with Omar Torrijos and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos, men who refuse to be corrupted, then the second line of defense is we send in the jackals. And the jackals either overthrow governments or they assassinate the people who won't be corrupted. In the case of both Omar Torrijos and Jaime Roldos, they were assassinated because I failed. And once that happens and a new government comes in, and boy, it's going to toe the line because the new president knows what will happen if he doesn't. In the case of Iraq, both of those things failed. Economic hitmen were not able to get through to Saddam Hussein. We tried very hard. We tried to get him to accept a deal very similar to what the House of Saud had accepted in Saudi Arabia, an amazing deal from our standpoint, but he wouldn't accept it. And so the jackals went in to take him out. They couldn't. His security was very good. After all, he had one time worked for the CIA. He'd been hired to assassinate a former president of Iraq and failed, but he knew the system, and he had these look-alike doubles. It's very hard to assassinate a president unless there's people on the inside helping you. And if the people on the inside don't even know whether they're guarding the real guy or a double, it makes it very difficult for them and very, very risky for them. So we couldn't take him out. So in '91, the first President Bush sent in the troops, and we figured at that point, which is the last step. If the economic hitmen fail, the jackals fail, then we send in the military. And of course, all these people always know that the military is standing off in the wings to go in if everything else fails. So in '91, we send in the troops, and we take out the Iraqi military. So we assume at that point that Saddam Hussein is going to come around. We could have taken him out, of course, at that time. But we didn't want to. He's the kind of strong man we like. He controls his people. We thought he could control the Kurds and keep the Iranians in their border and keep pumping oil for us. And then once we took out his military, now he's going to come around. So the economic hitmen go back in the 90s without success. If they'd had success, he'd still be running the country. We'd be selling him all the fighter jets he wants and everything else he wants. But they couldn't, they didn't have success. The jackals couldn't take him out again, so we sent the military in once again, and this time we did the complete job and took him out, and in the process created for ourselves some very, very lucrative construction deals. We had to reconstruct a country that we'd essentially destroyed, which is a pretty good deal if you own construction companies, big ones. So those are really, Iraq shows the three stages. The economic hitmen failed there, the jackals failed there, and as a final measure, the military goes in.
Mel K, whose the title of her book is Infiltration Instead of Invasion, I think she's close.
You know that feeling a lot of us have right now that no matter who we voted for, no matter which party's in charge, nothing seems to change. Well, my guest tonight says that's not a failed system. That's actually the system. Joining me tonight is Mel K, host of The Mel K Show, journalist and author of the new book, Infiltration Instead of Invasion, America Betrayed, 1944 to 1954. In her book, Mel details how after World War II, a small network of bankers, intelligence officials, political insiders, and international power brokers began building something that would operate above elected governments, not through military conquest, not through tanks rolling down the streets, but through financial institutions, intelligence networks, and global organizations, essentially the deep state. She says the critical period was between 1944 and 1954.
She's not on the money. She's not spot on. In other words, she's close. She's very close. The problem is with her is she says, oh, there's this decade back to 1944 to 1954, something like that. And I'm like, you haven't gone deep enough down that rabbit hole, sweetheart. Because the thing is you didn't go far enough back. Because the Dulles brothers, they basically had connections during World War I, not just World War II, and they helped set up the national security state during World War II or after World War II, which was basically 1944 to 1954, and I honestly should say. This is also a shout out to maybe Norman Dodd.
That what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education.
There's quite a bit of publicity given to your conversation with Rowan Gaither. Would you please tell us who he was and what was that conversation you had with him?
Rowan Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither had sent for me when I found it convenient to be in New York, asked me to call upon him at his office, which I did. And on arrival, after a few amenities, Mr. Gaither said, Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves. And before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is? I said, yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know. Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair. I of course, didn't, but my response to Mr. Gaither then was, well, Mr. Gaither, I can now answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you just told me. So why don't you I said, of course, legally you're entitled to make grants for this purpose, but I don't think you're entitled to withhold that information from the people of the country to whom you're indebted for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell the people of the country that's what you told me? And his answer was, we would not think of doing any such thing. So then I said, well, Mr. Gaither, obviously, you forced the Congress to spend this money in order to find out what you just told me.
Norman Dodd's Reese Committee did fall in, I think, 1952. So it is in that time frame that Mel K talks about. But the thing is, the Dulles brothers made connections during the Versailles Treaty. They were the Sullivan and Cromwell legal or law office that they were part of, and I think it's from New York. These guys were actually part of that crew that drew up the Versailles Treaty to end World War I. So they made it punitive against the Germans. They did. So why did they do all these things? They made connections. They made connections during that Versailles Treaty. So what were these Americans doing? And so it started technically before, probably even before even World War I was even finished. And I would go so far as to say that even the Spanish-American War basically shows that the first successful third-party challenger to the dominant two-party system, the two-party tyranny in the United States, was the Populist Party of 1892. I said 1892. In other words, that's 100 years before Ross Perot. So in 1892, the Populists were basically pushing for a third party, and they were actually looking pretty good because they were the first ones to actually earn electorates outside, or candidates outside of the two parties, and that was, like I said, 1892. The people from the 19th century to 20th century, like I said, they had some transitions. They had some things going on. They had something, they were kept pretty busy and pretty distracted, just like the rest of us today. So these ilk, I would say, like, what was his name? John D. Rockefeller's father, who was basically Devil Bill Livingston.
Oil. From farm to pharmaceutical, diesel truck to dinner plate, pipeline to plastic product, it is impossible to think of an area of our modern-day lives that is not affected by the petrochemical industry. The story of oil is the story of the modern world. Parts of that story are well known. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, the internal combustion engine and the transformation of global transport, the House of Saud and the oil wars in the Middle East. Other parts are more obscure. The quest for oil in the outbreak of World War I, the petrochemical interests behind modern medicine, the big oil money behind the Green Revolution and the Gene Revolution. But that story, properly told, begins somewhere unexpected. Not in Pennsylvania with the first commercial drilling operation and the first oil boom, but in the rural backwoods of early 19th century New York State. And it doesn't start with crude oil or its derivatives. but a different product altogether: snake oil. Dr. Bill Livingston, celebrated cancer specialist, was the very image of the traveling snake oil salesman. He was neither a doctor nor a cancer specialist. His real name was not even Livingston. More to the point, the rock oil tonic he pawned was a useless mixture of laxative and petroleum, and had no effect whatsoever on the cancer of the poor townsfolk he conned into buying it. He lived the life of a vagabond, always on the run from the last group of people he had fooled, engaged in ever more outrageous deceptions to make sure that the past wouldn't catch up with him. He abandoned his first wife and their 6 children to start a bigamous marriage in Canada at the same time as he fathered 2 more children by a 3rd woman. He adopted the name Livingston after he was indicted for raping a girl in Cayuga in 1849. When he wasn't running away from them or disappearing for years at a time, he would teach his children the tricks of his treacherous trade. He once bragged of his parenting technique: "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make 'em sharp." A towering man of over 6 feet and with natural good looks that he used to his advantage, he went by Big Bill. Others, less generously, called him Devil Bill. But his real name was William Avery Rockefeller, and it was his son, John D. Rockefeller, who would go on to found the Standard Oil monopoly and become the world's first billionaire.
Literally, he was a snake oil salesman. So there's little wonder that they used the Flexner Report back in 1910.
In 1901, John D. established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. The institute recruited Simon Flexner, a pathology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, to serve as its director. His brother, Abraham, was an educator who was contracted by the Carnegie Foundation to write a report on the state of the American medical education system. His study, the Flexner Report, along with the hundreds of millions of dollars that the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations were to shower on medical research in the coming years, resulted in a sweeping overhaul of the American medical system. Naturopathic and homeopathic medicine, medical care focused on unpatentable, unmarketable natural remedies and cures, was now dismissed as quackery. Only drug-based allopathic medicine requiring expensive medical procedures and lengthy hospital stays was to be taken seriously.
The fortunes of Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller financed surgery, radiation, and synthetic drugs. They were to become the economic foundations of the new medical economy.
The takeover of the medical industry was accomplished by the takeover of the medical schools. Well, the people that we're talking about, Rockefeller and Carnegie in particular, came to the picture and said, "We will put up money." They offered tremendous amounts of money to the schools that would agree to cooperate with them. The donors said to the schools, we're giving you all this money. Now, would it be too much to ask if we could put some of our people on your board of directors to see that our money is being spent wisely? Almost overnight, all of the major universities received large grants from these sources and also accepted 1, 2, or 3 of these people that I mentioned on their board of directors, and the schools literally were taken over by the financial interests that put up the money. Now, what happened as a result of that is that the schools did receive an infusion of money. They were able to build new buildings. They were able to add expensive equipment to their laboratories. They were able to hire top-notch teachers. But at the same time as doing that, they skewed the whole thing in the direction of pharmaceutical drugs. That was the efficiency in philanthropy. The doctors from that point forward in history would be taught pharmaceutical drugs. All of the great teaching institutions in America were captured by the pharmaceutical interests in this fashion. And it's amazing how little money it really took to do it.
To actually capture the healthcare industry. In other words, they basically said, okay, we'll disenfranchise or basically make, all these other philosophies of medicine look, silly or maybe as a quackery. And so they basically proceeded to promote pharmacology. So pharmacology, of course, is based on the petroleum byproducts. So pharmacology is based on, well, profiteering or lining their pockets. So since they already had the market for, well, oil and fossil fuels, which is also a misnomer, that's another argument. But anyway, so you had all these things that, going on that basically shows that there was already a lot of con jobs and a lot of fraud going on in American society, just that it became commonplace. And so that's why the Flexner report basically, they took over the medical industry. They basically said, okay, we'll throw like $180 million at it in 1910 after the Flexner report. And so that's like $20 billion today in today's money. So they used that $20 billion to build universities, to build medical schools, to build hospitals. So that way they could, of course, monopolize the medical industry. So, there's an incentive. It's not philanthropy. It's not that they're doing it out of their goodwill. They're not doing it because they're, bleeding hearts. They basically are not doing it because for you. They're doing it for them. And so they basically maintain control through these things that they basically developed and built. So anyone who doesn't get that, I apologize, but you're being played. And so con artists and con jobs are basically just a part of modern life because, honestly, like I said, John D. Rockefeller and his ilk and Andrew Carnegie and others like Rothschilds, these people, and of course J.P. Morgan, so these people are just basically lining each other's pockets. Well, like I said, the first assumption is that America is no longer democracy, it's oligarchy. American or European corruption is global on scale. 3, the corruption was achieved through subversion or spycraft. And 4, that a grassroots movement leading to demonetization and minimalization of government is the only way we actually will get our government back. Going to have to get rid of probably the national security state. You're going to have to probably repeal the National Security Act of 1947. Get rid of the CIA. Get rid of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Get rid of the National Security Council. Get rid of what's left? Oh, the Pentagon. Get rid of them. I'm talking about get rid of the national security states across the board, worldwide. That's why we need to be having negotiations, and that's why when I say I stand on the shoulders of giants, Howard Zinn back in 1970, he had it understood. He had it so clear. I would say he was spot on.
I start from the supposition that the world is topsy-turvy, that things are all wrong, that the wrong people are in jail and the wrong people are out of jail, that the wrong people are in power and the wrong people are out of power, that the wealth is distributed in this country and the world in such a way as not simply to require small reform, but to require a drastic reallocation of wealth. I start from the supposition that we don't have to say too much about this because all we have to do is think about the state of the world today and realize that things are all upside down. Now, if you don't think, if you just listen to TV and read scholarly things, you actually begin to think that things are not so bad, or that just little things are wrong. But you have to get a little detached and then come back and look at the world, and you are horrified. So we have to start from that supposition that things are really topsy-turvy. And our topic is topsy-turvy, civil disobedience. Now, as soon as you say the topic is civil disobedience, you're saying our problem is civil disobedience. That is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is the numbers of people all over the world who have obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their government and have gone to war. And millions have been killed because of this obedience. We recognize this for Nazi Germany. We know that the problem there was obedience, that the people obeyed Hitler. People obeyed. That was wrong. They should have challenged, and they should have resisted. And if we were only there, we would have showed them. Even in Stalin's Russia, we can understand that. People are obedient. All these herd-like people. Remember those bad old days when people were exploited by feudalism? Everything was terrible in the Middle Ages. But now we have Western civilization, the rule of law. The rule of law has regularized and maximized the injustice that existed before the rule of law. That is what the rule of law has done. When in all the nations of the world, the rule of law is the darling of the leaders and the plague of the people, we ought to begin to recognize this. We have to transcend these national boundaries in our thinking. Nixon and Brezhnev have much more in common with one another than we have with Nixon. J. Edgar Hoover has far more in common with the head of the Soviet secret police than he has with us. It's the international dedication to law and order that binds the leaders of all countries in a comradely bond. That's why we're always so surprised when they get together. They smile, they shake hands, they smoke cigars. They really like one another, no matter what they say. What we are trying to do, I assume, is really to get back to the principles and aims and spirit of the Declaration of Independence. This spirit is resistance to illegitimate authority and to forces that deprive people of their life and liberty and right to pursue happiness. And therefore, under these conditions, it urges the right to alter or abolish their current form of government, and the stress had been on abolish. But to establish the principles of the Declaration of Independence, we're going to need to go outside the law, to stop obeying the laws that demand killing or that allocate wealth the way it's been done, or that put people in jail for petty technical offenses and keep other people out of jail for enormous crimes. My hope is that this kind of spirit will take place not just in this country, but in other countries, because they all need it. People in all countries need the spirit of disobedience to the state, which is not a metaphysical thing, but a thing of force and wealth. And we need a kind of declaration of interdependence among people in all countries of the world who are striving for the same thing.
Back in 1970, he knew what was the game. I would also say that there were two actors. One was Sean Wallace and Andre Gregory, I believe it was. Those two Jewish actors in the 1980s, they had a movie called My Dinner with Andre.
Well, why do you think that is? I mean, why is that? I mean, is it just because people are lazy today, or they're bored? I mean, are we just like bored, spoiled children who've just been lying in the bathtub all day, just playing with their plastic duck, and now they're just thinking, well, what can I do?
Okay, yes, we are bored. We're all bored now. But has it ever occurred to you, Wally, that the process that creates this boredom that we see in the world now may very well be a self-perpetuating, unconscious form of brainwashing created by a world totalitarian government based on money, and that all of this is much more dangerous than one thinks, and it's not just a question of individual survival, Wally, but that somebody who's bored is asleep, and somebody who's asleep will not say no? See, I keep meeting these people. I mean, just a few days ago, I met this man whom I greatly admire. He's a Swedish physicist, Gustav Bjornstrand, and he told me that he no longer watches television, he doesn't read newspapers, and he doesn't read magazines. He's completely cut them out of his life because he really does feel that we're living in some kind of Orwellian nightmare now, and that everything that you hear now contributes to turning you into a robot. when I was at Findhorn, I met this extraordinary English tree expert who had devoted his life to saving trees. Just got back from Washington, lobbying to save the redwoods. He's 84 years old. He always travels with a backpack because he never knows where he's going to be tomorrow. And when I met him at Findhorn, he said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "New York." He said, "Ah, New York, yes, that's a very interesting place. Do you know a lot of New Yorkers who keep talking about the fact that they want to leave but never do?" And I said, "Oh, yes." And he said, "Why do you think they don't leave?" I gave him different banal theories. He said, "Oh, I don't think it's that way at all." He said, "I think that New York is the new model for the new concentration camp, where the camp has been built by the inmates themselves, and the inmates are the guards, and they have this pride in this thing they've built. They've built their own prison, and so they exist in a state of schizophrenia, where they are both guards and prisoners, and as a result, they no longer have, having been lobotomized, the capacity to leave the prison they've made, or to even see it as a prison." And then he went into his pocket and he took out a seed for a tree and he said, "This is a pine tree." He put it in my hand and he said, "Escape before it's too late." See, actually for 2 or 3 years now, Chiquita and I have had this very unpleasant feeling that we really should get out. And we really should feel like Jews in Germany in the late 30s. Get out of here. Of course, the problem is where to go, because it seems quite obvious that the whole world is going in the same direction. See, I think it's quite possible that the 1960s represented the last burst of the human being before he was extinguished, and that this is the beginning of the rest of the future now, and that from now on there'll simply be all these robots walking around, feeling nothing, thinking nothing, and there'll be nobody left almost to remind them that there once was a species called a human being, with feelings and thoughts, and that history and memory are right now being erased, and soon nobody will really remember that life existed on the planet.
They also were talking about this pretty profoundly, you know, while I was still in high school. So these men are shoulders that I stand on. These people understood America's threat. These people understood that if we sit still, they'll consume us all. If you do not have judges who honestly and earnestly recuse themselves justly from a court case, then you know you have corruption. Because if they have, Google stock, they cannot be the judge to decide that case, because they know that they cannot be fully objective. That's why they have to recuse themselves from that if they are a stockholder of that said company. So these type of things lets us know just how corrupt our system is, because we have today judges who refuse to recuse themselves from cases even when they have, stock options, of that company. For example, that's just one example. But the reason I bring it up is because if this is what government is supposed to be, and because government is, according to Thomas Paine and the Founding Fathers, a minimalist action, because we don't trust government, because I don't want to have to surrender my authority. I don't have to basically surrender everything that makes me who I am and my moral judgment. I don't want to acquiesce. I don't want to have to surrender everything about what is right and wrong. That's why I want to minimalize your jurisdiction as a government. Because the thing is, I don't need you adjudicating basically thought crimes. I don't need you adjudicating like at Palantir, talking about, let's do like Minority Report, laws. Are you kidding me? That's science fiction crap. That's pseudoscience. And you're basically going to predict crimes? That's just a justification for it's kind of like we got a 14-day incubation period on this COVID-19. Same reason. It's a 2-week lockdown. The only reason you even propose a 14-day incubation period is to justify your lockdown. Same thing. You basically can justify putting people in prison that you don't like or can't agree with you, who are dissenters, for your crimes. And so you basically are using predictive models to basically say, there is a Minority Report. Jesus, if you give these people that kind of room, you get what you deserve. I can't believe people would actually be so naive. I've never considered myself an anarchist, but if the definition of an anarchist is just an anti-statism, someone who's anti-state. In other words, state is where they basically use law enforcement. So they basically force, because in other words, you notice that law enforcement are the only ones, or maybe military are the only ones who have license to kill or license to violence. Why is that? Because the state is the only one who has legal license to basically, or jurisdiction to actually use violence or use force as a means to get other people, to coerce other people to do what they want them to do. So when we talk about government, if you notice the relationships between, say, government and what is supposed to be a transhumanist relationship, how we treat our friends is usually through persuasion. Government is through coercion. In other words, government treats you like an enemy because we treat our friends with persuasion. We treat our enemies with coercion. We incentivize our friends. We basically find things that they will find common with us, that have common interest, that incentivizes them to actually do things with us because they want to do them, because they're just as rewarding to them as they are rewarding to us. But enemies, we use force. Friends, we use diplomacy. Enemies, we use brutality. Friends, we use words. Enemies, we use fists or weapons. Friends, we share. In other words, it's about giving. What can I give you? What can I share with you today? But enemies is zero sum. It's all about hoarding. Gimme, gimme, gimme. What can I get today? It's about basically greediness, envy, jealousy. It's about taking, not giving. So that's the overwhelming compilation or compelling of what people or how people are communicating with their enemy. While friends, it's about cooperation. Enemies is about competition. So these are completely different dynamics. So that's why I would say government today basically treats its own citizens as enemies, not as friends. So the thing is this what you really want for this paradigm that you live in? Do you really want your governments to see you as the enemy? Do you really want them to have predictive crimes to where, oh, okay, well, you said this, so we predict that you're going to commit a crime in the future, so you spend time in prison? That's insanity.